No, who knows what the appropriate background is? Everything and nothing. There's no particular background that is, in my view, privileged. If there were, if mastery of economics or of political science were the key to programmatic insight, there would be a great deal of programmatic insight in the world. And you know that that is not the case. All over the world, the educated political nations complain that their national politics fails to yield alternative programs. Yes?
If the papers are supposed to be reactionary papers, are they going to be addressing the subject matter of the lectures or readings, both? They're not research papers. Are we going to be expected to cite the readings and nothing else?
You're not really expected, you're not required to cite anything. So my idea here is that I will be trying to do something that is difficult and that we in general now in the world do not know how to do. We do not know how to think or to argue programmatically. There are the abstractions of political philosophy, and then there's a very context-oriented, situated policy discourse. But there's very little in between. And what, for the most part, there is not is the imagination of alternative institutional trajectories for society. So a major theme in the course is not only what these trajectories could or should be, but how we can begin to think about them and to talk about them. So I want to exemplify here an attempt to do that. And then I hope that that attempt will spark a response from you, not just in the form of analysis and criticism of that particular direction, but also in the form of an articulation by you of your project, your way of thinking, in general or in some particular context. That's the intention of the assignment of the papers. Any other question? So in this first introductory class, I want to move in 4 steps. And I will pause after each of these steps and invite your engagement. I hope that no one will feel inhibited by the awkwardness of the first class, and that you will feel free from the outset to engage. In the first step, I outline a point of departure for the argument, a view of the predicament of the disorientation of the progressives in contemporary societies. In the second step, I briefly exemplify this predicament in the context of the United States. In the third step, in the context of Europe. And in the fourth step of today's introductory argument, I want to say a word about what I believe is at stake in such a project. not only politically, but also morally and spiritually. So first, the points of departure. My idea is that the progressives on the whole in the contemporary societies suffer from the lack of a project, from the lack of a crisis favoring transformation, from the lack of a social agent, and from the lack of a reliable way of thinking or form of discourse. First, they have no project, or rather, they have no project on which they can rely to promote their historical goals. Whether it is the goal of achieving greater equality or the goal of promoting a larger life for ordinary men and women. Here are a few alternative descriptions of this situation. A first account, in a nutshell, is that the progressives have ceased to believe in the governmental control or direction of the economy. But they understand, or partly understand, that compensatory redistribution through tax and transfer is not enough to achieve their historical goals. So if state control of the economy is too much or undesirable, and compensatory retrospective redistribution through tax and transfer is insufficient, what then should be the program? They do not know. On the whole, it seems they have no program. Their program is the program of their conservative adversaries with a humanizing discount. Now, on another account, the absence of a project might be described in the following way. We find two kinds of progressivism or leftism in the world today. There is a recalcitrant progressivism that resists the march to the market economy and to globalization, although it has no real alternative to them. It wants to contain them or to counterbalance them. And in particular, it wants to contain them or counterbalance them to the benefit of the historical constituency of the left or of the progressives in modern societies, which is the organized industrial labor force headquartered in the capital-intensive sectors of the production system. Then there is a second left, which you might call a resigned left. It accepts the market economy in its present institutional form, and it accepts globalization in its present course. And it proposes to humanize the established form of the market economy and of globalization, chiefly through the use of compensatory and retrospective redistribution by tax and transfer. Its leitmotif is the humanization of the inevitable. These are the two main variants of leftism or progressivism that exist in the world today. What for the most part seems not to exist and would be needed is a reconstructive progressivism or leftism that proposes to reorganize the market economy and then democratic politics and to reorient the course of globalization. That is what, for the most part, we seem not to have. The institutional project, the project with an institutional content, is for the most part not there. It is in this sense that I suggest that the first dimension, the first aspect of the predicament of the contemporary progressives is the lack of a project, that is to say, the lack of a reliable or promising project. A project that is something other than the attempt to slow down or to soften the project of their adversaries. The second dimension of the predicament of the contemporary progressives is the lack of a crisis, of adequate dimension, to generate or at least to favor structural change. We know that the major classical social theories, such as Marxism, on which the left and the progressives historically relied in much of the world, attributed transformation to an internal dialectic in society. But the harsh truth seems to be that for the most part in history, over the last few centuries, and certainly in the 20th century, transformation was most directly the result of crisis. Of crisis in the double form of war, world war, and economic collapse. The two world wars of the 20th century and the major economic collapse of the 1930s were the chief incitements to structural transformation. There is in this historical fact a deep problem, a problem which should be one of the major concerns of programmatic thought. Change seems to depend on crisis. But does change depend naturally and necessarily on crisis? Or is the degree of the dependence of change on crisis itself variable? Should it not be one of the objectives of the progressives